Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, we're going to investigate the new auto farm placement added in the April patch. This is something I didn't mention in my patch preview video, as well as the change to Auto Scout, which we'll touch on as well, since these were late additions to the patch notes, so you may or may not have heard these things were coming. There's a few things to look at here, including not just how the new farming placement works, but we'll cover some tips, and then talk about the autofication of the game. To start with the basics, pretty simply the change is that if you have a mill built or have a foundation, you can hold shift when placing farms and clicking on the mill, where the game will now automatically place them in ideal spots. It's a nice little feature that Age of Empires 4 has had since release, and should lead to more efficient and faster to place farms in the late game, speeding up a repetitive task. One thing to keep in mind is that the actual farming rate benefit to this is probably smaller than you expect if you have the tech handcart. Farms are capped in how quickly they can generate food, and with handcart, most farmers are hitting that cap, even in what appear to be somewhat inefficient situations. To use this setup as an example, they may look like pretty poorly placed farms that you get by just quickly shift-clicking the old way, but these farmers are collectively working at about 98% of perfect efficiency, with quite a few farms toward the middle actually at 100%, and even the worst defenders here are still over 90% efficient compared to perfect placement. Worth noting is there's also no upper limit to how far away the farms can be auto-placed, and will continue to fill any space that you've already explored. If you had the 80 or 90,000 wood, you could theoretically cover an entire 1v1 map in farms based around 1 mil. Next though, let's play around with exactly how this works, and put the new mechanic to the test. First off, here I have 4 mills already built, and we're going to add farms with the new mechanic. Now, if I were to manually place a lot of farms, naturally we'd want to start around 1 mil, but move in the direction of the others. A real player with a lot of time might come up with something like this. So is the new mechanic able to factor in the complete picture, so to speak? It turns out it doesn't. As I place more farms using the new mechanic, notice they just stack around that 1 mil and radiate outward without any sort of bias toward minimizing distances to any extra mills. Right away, this suggests there may still be some advantages to manually placing farms yourself, whether it be to favor a particular side of the mill close to a town center for protection's sake, or in situations like this one shown. Now you might be thinking, hold on, a better way to approach this setup is to try to place farms circling each mill one at a time, though that also doesn't work super well in this example, as it doesn't make any attempt to fit the farms nicely together, and we end up with something not much better than you'd probably get by doing it quickly yourself. Clearly, it's not the smartest logic behind the mechanic, which you could argue is actually a good thing, creating situations where being more intentional with the direction you place new farms, such as the side of a mill closer to a town center, could be advantageous. Likewise, you can do all of this around a town center as well, but notice it has no special regard for straggler trees. A lot of the time, it's a good idea to avoid removing stragglers with your earliest farms, since they give newly created villagers something to work on temporarily. And again, you could argue the mechanic not being very smart about this leaves room for player skill and decision making to give a slight advantage. Now though, let's get to some good tips to keep in mind, as you may have already caught something pretty inefficient going on here, which can be avoided. Notice if I have my villagers build a mill and place a whole bunch of farms, after the mill is built, all of the villagers go to that first farm I placed. From the villagers' perspective, they're just trying to follow my instructions in exactly the order I asked, and they are smart enough that after the first farm is built, they then spread out. But there's really 2 problems here. First, there's a lot of bumping and inefficiency with having them all pile up on one farm. But second, as they spread out, they do that relative to the first farm they built, and not the mill. You can see a villager ended up 3 layers out from the mill when there's still a 2-layer farm available. It would help if I didn't overbuild the number of farms to this degree, but there's actually an easy way to avoid this. The trick is after I've shift queued a set of farms, I can let go of shift and right-click the mill a final time before it's built. If I do that, they'll spread themselves out much more cleanly, with 1 villager going to each farm, prioritizing only the closest ones. You may know this is a trick that works in AoE4's version of the mechanic as well. Another thing worth pointing out is while the farms are placed in the same order every time with an isolated mill, the mechanic is smart enough to deal with existing farms that set it off the template. Here I have some not perfectly placed farms done manually, and notice that shift-clicking the mill does a good job working itself into the existing pattern without any issues. A little tip when adding farms to a mill that you've already built, splitting your villagers manually can be a nice way to help them be a bit more efficient in getting started on their farms. Now, I've brought up AoE4 a couple of times, as it used this mechanic first, but one thing I like is AoE2 has really improved on the mechanic with much smarter villager behavior. Remember, if we didn't right-click the mill without shift, then all of our villagers piled up on one farm and then spread out pretty quickly. We should appreciate how smart these villagers are being here, as in AoE 4, if you shift queue a mill in a set of farms without right-clicking the mill at the end, the villagers actually walk around as a group and seed every single farm without leaving anyone behind to work them, which just delays any food production by a long time, as they literally follow your orders to the letter when it comes to queuing. On the other hand, an arguably better way that AoE 4 handles all of this though, is when you hover your mouse over the mill, you have a bit of influence on which direction the next farm is placed. The new AoE2 mechanic just places farms in the same pattern every time, without that ability to suggest a direction. So you can see how the same mechanic can be implemented in different ways. So that's the basics of the new auto farm placement, and how it compares to any experience you may have had with AoE 4. Before we finish, I want to quickly touch on the bigger picture though, and why this change is somewhat controversial, being part of a larger discussion. Given the game is over 20 years old now, naturally, some players can be wary of any shift toward automating routine tasks that could change the feel of the game or remove ways to differentiate skill level between players. There's certainly a balance between keeping the old guard happy and making the game intuitive and modern for newer returning players, who, if they play other RTS games, might assume these sorts of quality of life features are present. While I think there is a red line when these things would be over-automated, I don't think this crosses it, or is even all that close, honestly. And I'd have said the same thing about auto-reseeding, queuing technologies, and queuing villager tasks, which have all been well received. For me, an example of a red line would be if town centers could auto-queue villagers, which I know is a thing in Age of Mythology and the Ottomans in AoE 3, or maybe we should call them the Ottomans, which is fine, as those were design choices made early on for both games. In AoE 2 though, the ability to distract an opponent during a raid from their macro and being able to manage that aspect of your economy under pressure is one of the core skills and challenges of the game. For me, I would actually say the second automated function added this patch is, if anything, a little closer to that line, which is that Auto Scout is now being given to all Scout line units, not just your starting one. Playing around with it, it is a little suboptimal, I've noticed, with units sometimes clumping up together and other times not, while also showing some of the characteristic biases of Auto Scout in general, with units seemingly preferring the right side of the map to explore first. Arguably, the fact it's a little weird at scouting actually means there's still a role for player skill. The two situations I think this will be massive are, first, after a scout rush, if you have a few injured scouts, you can now use them to explore the map instead of manually tasking them. The second is Hussars exploring the map at the end of the game to find hidden bases or units. Keep in mind, this is not a seek and destroy command, as they don't actually fight any units they encounter. For me, this does open the door to the devs eventually adding a seek and destroy command, which is something many RTS games have to mop up defeated enemies on the map, but AoE 2 has never included, given its unusually high emphasis on unit control. The continued expansion of Auto Scout, though, makes me think that may be something added down the road, and I'm kind of curious what you guys think of that. Of all the things being automated, that seems like the most likely to happen, that to me brushes up against that line of quality of life versus taking away an important skill, specifically map awareness and unit control. I suspect, in general, the higher a player's APM, the more likely they dislike all of this continued automation, as they might feel like it's taking away their competitive edge. So far though, I think you could argue both the new auto farm placement and even the scouting behavior have at least some trade-offs and situations you're better off doing things manually, especially your initial scouting and early farm placement. That's probably a good way to compromise, letting more skilled players get small edges, and is where the auto scouting FSR gives me slightly more hesitation, as it truly will be the best way to scout the map with late game Hussars. In the past, these sorts of quality of life changes, it has to be said, have freed up even more time and attention for higher level micro, and arguably even more emphasis on strategy, since you can't rely on high APM to out-macro your opponent quite as much. Again, I'm curious what you guys think of the whole autofication thing that's happening over time, and if it's a necessary part of a thriving game, or getting too far away from the game's roots. That'll do it for this one though. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.